Okay, let's start by setting up a few options in the document that we are going to be using all throughout this project. I want to remind you that the project we are going to be making is a mockup, a fake screenshot for demonstration purposes. This means that some of the assets that you're going to see in this project may need to be adjusted to the needs of the game engine. For example, in this mockup, we are going to treat the background as if it were an illustration, only worrying about what's on the screen. But if you were creating the background asset for an actual game, you may need to extend the background's different shapes so you can parallax the different layers when the character moves. I can't possibly know how you plan to build your game or the tools that you're going to use. This project will teach you everything you need to draw the art for your game. It's just that the details of adapting it to your game tools, it's up to you. With that out of the way, there are a couple of options we need to set up so we can work comfortably. Remember that we are going to be working with tiles here, so the very first step should be enabling and configuring the grid so we can build the tile set we talked so much in the previous lesson. Inkscape brings a fully featured and very versatile grid system that's very easy to use. These options are in the Document Properties dialog. So go to File, Document Properties. The grid options are in the Grid tab. To be able to use a grid, you'll have to create it first. First select the type of grid from the drop-down, rectangular or axonometric. The rectangular grid option will create a normal rectangular grid. This is the one we need. The other one, the axonometric grid, will create a grid with inclined angles. This is mostly used to create isometric art. We are not going to be using this type of grid, so you can safely ignore it. A curious thing about this way of handling grids is that you can create more than one grid in the document. Every time you click on the new button, you create a new grid. This is completely unnecessary, because you'll rarely need more than one single grid to draw whatever you want. To remove a grid, just click on the button that says Remove. Now for the actual grid options. These options are pretty self-explanatory. They will disable or hide the grid. The next option is very important. Here you select the unit with which you will change the values in these options. If you are following along and want to have the exact same numbers than I do, make sure you set this drop-down to px, pixels. I'm going to be using a few specific values for line and sizes, and I'm going to be using the grid to calculate those sizes. I already have all the numbers that work out for me, so if you're following along, make sure to copy all these values. The origin options just slides the grid in the horizontal or vertical axis. Completely useless to use, so you can just ignore these two options. Spacing will make the grid bigger or smaller. Like I said already, I have the size that will work better for us, and that will neatly divide the area of work into nice workable squares. Set the X and Y spacing value to 30. You should see that the grid got a bit bigger. To help you handle yourself better, Inkscape has the two options to add a different colored grid line every certain quantity of other grid lines. For our purposes, I strongly recommend you to set it to 2. So there are 2 squares inside of a stronger colored square. Believe me, this will help you get a bit less confused when moving objects around the grid. The minor and major grid color lines will change the colors and alpha of the minor and major grid lines. This option you can leave it like this, but it can be helpful to change the opacity of the major grid lines so they are a bit more visible than the minor ones. Just click on the color label and move the alpha slider so it's a bit more clearer. Here it will be very easy to change color if you want. Just make sure you don't pick a really strong color that distracts you while working. So try to keep the alpha on the lower side. And that's all you need to know about creating grids for our project. They will really help you design and work with the different tiles we'll be making. But now it's time to learn how to actually use them for drawing. First, of course, you need to enable the snapping functionality in the snapping options bar. Like I said in the Inkscape mini course, when you enable snapping, there should be a few options enabled by default. I recommend you to not touch anything here if you don't know what each of these buttons do. However, if you want to be able to snap to grids, you should enable this little button. By toggling this button on and off, you'll enable and disable the snapping to the grids. This is really useful, because you won't always want to draw to the grid. Sometimes you want to draw other things to the side. So at the moment of working, you're gonna need to constantly come to this button to switch on and off the grid snapping. Great, let's try it. Pick the pen tool and create nodes anywhere in the canvas. You should see that the nodes snap to the grid. Now if you move this shape with the object tool, you should see that the shape also snaps to the grid. A very important detail is that when you move an object with the object tool, the node closest to the mouse will be the one snapping to the grid. This is a common functionality of all snapping in Inkscape. So for example, if I drag this polygon from closer to the top, you'll see the little label that indicates to you that the top node is the one snapping to the grid. But if I drag the shape from the bottom right, you'll see that the bottom right node will be the one that's snapping. And the same happens if I drag from close to the bottom left. This functionality will be important later on when we work on tiles, so keep it in mind. One last thing before the end of this lesson. We want to make a mock-up of a platformer game for mobile phones. So in order to better pre-visualize the area of illustration, I want to draw a rectangle with the dimensions of the screen. I know multiple phones have different dimensions, but we are learning the basics here and we care more about clarity than staying true to the dimensions of a phone. So we are gonna be using a standard monitor dimensions for this game, 1280 by 720, which is also the resolution of the videos in this course. So grab the rectangle tool and drag a normal rectangle of any size. Now with the rectangle tool and the rectangle selected, go to the tool controls bar and make sure this drop down is set to px, pixels. Now we can input the size we want in pixels. In the double view input, set it to 1280, and in the H input, set it to 720. Also make sure Rx and Ry are set to 0. These values control the roundness of the corners, and we don't want any roundness. If they have a value, you can click on this button to set it to 0. Remember, this is gonna be the guide that will show the display area, so it shouldn't have any fill whatsoever, only a single black stroke. And now you should see that the grid dimensions that we set up a moment ago fit nicely as far as size with the illustration area. Each measured square is gonna be a single tile. If you were working with different screen proportions or different tile sizes, you may want to experiment a bit with the actual size of the grid in the document properties dialog, so that one major square equals one tile in your game. Now it's time to start drawing the assets. And I want to start by creating an asset that uses the grid we created in the last lesson, while at the same time demonstrates in a simplified way pretty much every single function that we are going to be using all throughout the rest of the course. We are going to start by creating our version of the classic question block that appears in most Mario games and its clones. Now, a question block may not seem like an extremely complex asset to make, but I guarantee that we are going to be using 95% of the tools and techniques that you're going to be using to create the other more complex assets. So I think it's a good place to start. One last thing before we start with this lesson. If you watch the Inkscape mini course, in the tips lesson I strongly recommended you to start using shortcuts. There I say that you should have nice comfortable shortcuts for the 4 most used tools in the toolbox: the object, node, pen and dropper tool. Well, I want to double down on what I said, because from now on, all throughout this course, I'll be using shortcuts to speed up the whole process. I'll remind you that you can change the shortcuts by going to Edit, Preferences, Interface, Keyboard Shortcuts, and the tools are in the Context submenu. I still recommend you to set them to the keys A, S, D, and F, or something similar so they are close to the other default shortcuts. I also have other shortcuts for other operations, but those are not nearly as important. You can go making other shortcuts as you need when you have more experience with the program. Great, let's begin. Grab the rectangle tool, and with the option Snap into Grid enabled, draw a rectangle that fits a single major square. You should see the little blue X as you snap while drawing. First of all, we don't want a stroke in this object yet. You'll see why in a minute, so disable it. Now, in most Mario games and clones, question blocks tend to be of a light yellowish orange, so give it that color. You can copy my colors if you want. As always, I'm using the HSL mode, so you'll have to copy each number for each slider. One last thing, we are gonna be copying the style of the more modern cell phone platformer games, so with the rectangle modifier, round off a bit the edges. You may want to disable snapping, so it won't mess you up as you make small adjustments from now on. Okay, so now we're gonna add a very simple light and shadow to make the asset look a bit nicer and more detailed. Nothing too complex, just a simple hard highlight on top and a hard shadow below. Trust me, a simple highlight and shadow will go a long way to make your art nicer. To create these two shapes, we are gonna be using the intersection method, which you should be familiar with if you watch the techniques lesson. So if you have problems getting something that I'm doing, be sure to rewatch those lessons again. So grab the pen tool and draw the highlight shape on the top part. Notice that I'm following the roundness of the top. It's not just a straight line. Another thing, the highlight is a bit asymmetrical and tilted to one side. This will not only imply that the light source is slightly tilted to the left, but also make the whole object a bit more interesting. I always avoid creating straight lines when I can, and the highlight and shadows is a good place to do this. Of course, don't overdo it. Just a slight tilt is enough to give a more dynamic feel to the whole object. Since the highlight implies that the light source is coming from the top left, the shadow is gonna be slightly tilted to the right. And I'm using the intersection technique to trim the excess off. A very important tip is that you want to constantly zoom to the distance from where it's gonna be viewed. Remember that this mockup represents something that will be displayed in a mobile phone, and that this block is gonna be the size of a single tile. It's a very common beginner mistake to zoom in and draw the sizes of objects completely ignoring the distance from where it's gonna be seen. So always zoom out and make sure that everything has the right proportions and that it's visible. Okay, now to give it some color. Let's just use the direct color technique. By now you should know the steps. Select the highlight and remove the stroke. Sample the local color, go to the L slider and move it a bit up. Repeat the same steps with the shadow, but now move the L slider a bit down. And we are almost done. But there is one important thing that needs to be done, and that is the question mark. And for that we are gonna do something neat. We're gonna make a card symbol. Okay, the first step is making the silhouette of the symbol. And for that, we are not gonna complicate ourselves drawing it. It's just a question mark, so let's use the text tool. So pick the text tool and type a question mark. With the object tool, move the symbol to the center of the block, and holding Ctrl to keep the proportions, scale it so it has the correct size. Make sure it's nice and centered. If you want precision, you could use the Align and Distribute dialog. To open it, go to Object, Align and Distribute. Now select the question mark and then select the block. The order of selection matters here. Make sure the drop-down says Last Selected. And click on these two buttons to center the symbol horizontally and then vertically. Now the symbol is in the exact center. Okay, I'm not convinced with the symbol. I feel that it needs to be a bit thicker. The problem is the font. By default, Inkscape always set the font as Arial. And you can try other fonts and see what funny symbols you can find. But the fastest solution is to change the weight. So with the symbol selected, select the text tool and go to the drop-down right next to the font drop-down and set the weight to the last value, heavy. And that's it, a nice thick question mark. You can try adjusting it a bit more, moving it around or scaling it while holding Shift to make it thicker. It's up to you. Now it's time to make the actual carved symbol. First of all, since we want to give the impression of a carved area, you should make the color of the symbol a bit darker, maybe slightly darker than the shadow color. This will imply that the surface is a bit receding down. Okay, the key to make an area give the impression of being carved in is to use a shadow dropping on itself and a thin rim highlight to accentuate the fact that there is a corner there. Let's start with the shadow. For this we are gonna use the difference technique that I showed you in the technique lesson 1. Rewatch that lesson if you are feeling a bit lost. So duplicate the symbol twice and make the top symbol of a clearly visible random color. Move the top symbol a bit down. Remember that the area that's showing through is gonna be the shadow. When you're happy, select the top symbol and the symbol right below and perform a difference. Now it's just a matter of giving the shadow a shadow color. Now let's repeat the same steps for the rim highlight. But here's a warning. Rim highlights are highlights that are captured by an edge, so they tend to be really small and more intense than normal highlights. Because this highlight is so small, it needs to be fairly intense to be noticeable. Also keep in mind what I told you a while ago about keeping an eye in the size and visibility of the shapes. You don't want to make the shadow or highlight too thin so that it won't be noticeable in the actual game. And that's it. I love creating carved out surfaces, because it really feels like you can go in and touch it. The illusion is really convincing if the colors are right. Of course, this technique I just showed you can be used with pretty much any carved surface you may want to do. Okay, we are done with the main object, but there is one last thing I want to do. In most Mario clones, especially for mobile phones, the assets often get a thick outline so they stand out from the background. So let's do that now. But before starting, there's a couple of things you should know. First, we want a consistent line weight across all assets. I made some tests and I got to the conclusion that at the size I'm working on, the best looking outline is gonna be 3 pixels wide. Of course, if you're not working at the same size that I am, then you should eyeball it and see what works best for you. The important thing is that it's consistent across all assets. Second, I strongly recommend you to separate this outline from the other shapes that makes up the block. You'll see why in a minute. So duplicate the main block shape and remove the fill and give it a stroke. This is gonna be our outline shape. First, the color. This type of games often use an outline with the same color than the main shape, but darker. There is one last detail regarding creating outlines. In Inkscape, all strokes are calculated from the center, in such a way that if you set a stroke of 10 pixels wide, the stroke will grow 5 pixels outside of the shape and 5 pixels inside of the shape. So if we set our outline to 3 pixels wide, 1.5 pixels will go inside and cover some details in the borders. Later on, if we want to create a bigger size outline, it will eat away even more details from the corners. Luckily, the solution is really simple. Send the stroke object to the bottom of the stack order, so it's below everything. That's one of the reasons why it's a good idea to separate the outline from the rest of the drawing. So now that's below, we need to set it to twice the pixel width, so it shows the pixel width that we want. So go to the stroke style, make sure the drop down next to the width input says px, and then set it to 6 pixels. And now we have an outline of 3 pixels wide that won't get in the way of our drawing. And we are done illustrating the question block. Now it will be a good idea to select everything and hit Ctrl G to group it, to make it easier to manipulate. One final small step. Because we made the block without having in consideration the stroke, now the entire object is 3 pixels bigger than the tile size. Well, this has a couple of solutions. You could just eyeball and try to make the whole shape the size of the tile, but this will bring you problems down the road when you want to export it to the actual game engine. The most accurate but slightly more complex solution is to use the snapping bar to make sure the block has the exact size of the tile. But the problem is that we need to enable and disable a couple of options. Don't worry, it's not that complex. Enable snapping again. What we want is to snap the block group to a grid rectangle. But the problem is that the options by default will make it snap to a corner node. But since the block is rounded, we want to snap it to the corner of the group instead. First, enable these two options. This will enable snapping to bounding boxes and snapping to corners in bounding boxes. A group is basically a bounding box, so this option has to be enabled. And one last step, disable this option. This will force snapping to nodes instead of bounding boxes, and it takes precedence over any other option, so you have to disable it temporarily. Now you should be able to make it snap to a corner, and using the opposite arrow, you can scale it in. As soon as you scale, it's gonna snap and fit perfectly inside the grid rectangle. Now don't forget to turn snapping to nodes back on, because it's really important for other types of snapping. Well, finally we are done with the block. What you saw here isn't terribly complex, but I can assure you that most of the other assets will be easier to make. Like I said in the intro of this lesson, I wanted to show you an example that demonstrates pretty much all features that we're going to be using in the rest of the course. There is another similar asset, and that is the activated question block. It's the block when has been hit, with no question mark and a darker color. I want you to make this block as an exercise assignment. And if you want extra points, start from 0. Don't use the finalize question block to recolor it and save you some work. I won't be showing you how to do it. First, I want to save some time, and second, it's just the same as this block, only easier. So I strongly recommend you to do it as an exercise. There are a lot of different types of blocks in these types of platformers. It will be a waste of time to show you how to make all possible types of blocks, considering they will use the same techniques you've seen before. However, I do want to make a slightly more complex type of block that will show you how to apply these techniques to more complex assets. In this lesson, we're going to be making this fairly complex brick block. Let's begin with the outline of the block. We want the exact same block roundness than the rest of the block in the game. It will look really weird if you see different types of blocks with different amounts of corner smoothness. So for this we can do a couple of things, but the easiest is to enter the question block group, remember with double click, and when you are inside select only the rectangle and hit Ctrl C to copy. Now very important, you are still inside of the group, so double click in any part of the canvas to leave the group. Make sure that this drop down here says that you are in a layer, otherwise you didn't actually left the group. Now hit Ctrl B to paste the rounded rectangle shape. If you want, you can place it in a grid, though we don't need it on a grid square at all for now. You can just disable the snapping and work to the side if you want. And now for the last step, give it a color. In this case, I'm gonna be using a brick dark orange. You can copy my colors if you want. The next few steps may seem a bit complex, but if you watch and study the previous lesson, you should be able to follow me without any problem. We want to imply that this block is made of a few smaller bricks. For that, we're going to follow a set of steps. First, with the pen tool, draw a few lines to delineate bricks. A couple of tips here. Don't worry about leaving the silhouette of the block. We're going to fix that later. Also, I like to make the bricks uneven and skewed. Like I said before, uneven areas are way more interesting than evenly divided areas with straight lines. So this way the whole block looks more appealing and cartoony. Of course, these divisions are meant to be the mortar joints. In masonry, that's the name for the space between the bricks that has mortar. So select all joints and make them bigger with the width drop-down. A 3 pixel width worked for me. Finally, give it a darker shade of the local color. By now I think I don't need to remind you the steps. To make it feel more cartoony and less artificial, let's make the joints a bit uneven. And for this we're gonna need to edit the stroke as if it were a path. So we are gonna need to transform all these strokes to path. Luckily that's something super easy to do. Select them all and go to path, stroke to path. Now all the strokes are path. If you want to simplify your work, you can join all these paths into a single shape so they are easier to manipulate. In this case, I just use the shortcut Ctrl+ to make a union. Now double click to add nodes, and then move the nodes a bit up and down to make the whole joints more uneven. Be subtle, this is gonna be more noticeable once we add the shadows and highlights. A nice detail you can do is to widen the places where two joints connect. Now there is the problem with the joint shapes. In some parts they leave the silhouette of the block. I believe that you can see how to solve this. That's right, just use an intersection. Great, we are done with the separation between bricks. But now I want to give it an extra something. I want to cut out a bit the silhouette in the area where the joints intersect with the border. And this will help further give the impression that this is a block made by bricks separated by mortar. Not to mention that will result in a more interesting silhouette. The easiest way to do this is to use a difference to cut out those parts. So grab the pen tool and draw this trapezius-like shape. Now, so you don't have to go one by one making 6 different operations, there is a nice little trick you can do. You can select all these shapes and join them into a single shape by using a union. And yes, unions work with shapes that are not intersecting. Now you have a single shape and you only have to do a single difference operation. And now the mortar joints need to be adjusted to this new block silhouette. So I'm sure you know what to do. perform an intersection with the block. Okay, now for the highlight and shadows, we're gonna follow the exact same steps we did before with the question block, with the only difference that we're giving each individual brick a highlight and shadow. So think of each brick as its own separate mini block. Grab the pen tool and draw the highlights. Remember everything that I showed you before. Keep in mind the roundness, make the highlight shape thick enough so it's visible from far away, and try to give it a subtle tilt so it looks a bit more interesting. When the highlight or shadow is close to an edge, you know what to do. You have to perform an intersection to remove the excess. But when it's here on the middle of the block, you have to hide one of the edges below the joint shape. There is no other way around. And for the color of the highlights and shadows, I think that you can do that on your own by now. One last important thing, the shape of the shadow or highlight will imply the form of the brick. So making these shapes that kinda wraps around each brick, it's a nice way to make the bricks more interesting. These choppy lines of the highlights and shadows imply that the particular brick is damaged or chipped away, which is always a nice way to add detail to anything architectural. And we can leave it like this and the job will be done. But I want to add some small extra details to make it look slightly more finished. First, we're gonna add some damage to the bricks. Grab the ellipse tool and draw a few ellipses of small irregular shapes here and there. Make sure to variate the size quite a lot. Add just a few to occupy large spaces with nothing on it. Also make sure the ellipses have the same color as the shadow. This is supposed to be a curved surface. Also, you don't have to use ellipses, but elliptical damage tend to look better than other shape damage. A nice trick is that you can draw more than one ellipse on top of each other to make the shape more irregular quickly without the need to go in there and modify the shape of the ellipse. Now you can add a nice bit of detail with these ellipses and then use the difference technique to create a thin but intense highlight shape. It's important to not overdo with these types of detail. Add these carved areas only to fill the empty areas. Otherwise it will look too filled and distracting. And now it looks a lot better with all that detail. But one last thing I want to do, grab the pen tool and create these polygonal bumps on the joint shapes. What you want to do is to imply that there is damage in the bricks. When you are done drawing them, join them to the joints with a union. Again, you should keep in mind the quantity of detail, and only add a few where it feels too empty. Here's another nice thing I like to do. I like to draw these cracks on the borders. But there is a really nice looking detail you can add specifically to the horizontal cracks, since they have a border that's opposite to a light source, and that is to give it a really thin highlight. This will make the crack pop up more. And now for the final step, the 3-pixel outline. Here you can simply pick the block shape, duplicate it, give it a 6-pixel stroke we talked about in the last lesson, and move it to the background. As far as the color, make it slightly darker than the darkest shape. And it's done. Don't forget to group everything and make it fit a grid unit like we did in the last lesson. This block is actually the single most complex shape you'll be doing in this course. So congratulations on finishing it. I want to remind you that if you want to use this block as a floor or walkable tile, it's gonna be problematic because of the roundness of the borders. A nice exercise will be to make one of these blocks to function as a floor, like the bricks in the level 1-2 in the original Mario. So you're gonna have to redraw one of these without the rounded edges, and maybe with a bit less detail so it won't call attention to itself since it's a floor tile. Now that we are done with the basic blocks, let's make the items. This will be the collectible coin, the power-up mushroom, the breakable crate, and of course the classic green pipe. We'll be drawing these items using the size of the tiles, just so we have some consistent numbers. Later on we may need to change the scale and make some last-minute adjustments when we put them in the final illustration. So let's start with arguably the easiest one, the classic green pipe. The shape of the pipe is super easy to make. Grab the rectangle tool and draw a rectangle of about 2 tiles by 2 tiles. And give it this green color that is roughly the same green that you see in the Mario games. Now to create the top part of the pipe, you could grab again the rectangle tool and draw a rectangle on top of the pipe, very carefully so it's in the exact center. But here it's easier to simply duplicate this rectangle with Ctrl D and then holding Ctrl so the movement is constrained to the vertical axis. Move it up and start scaling it into position holding Shift. This way you make sure this second rectangle is perfectly in the center. Just make it slightly lower than one tile and slightly wider than the other rectangle. But what makes this pipe object more interesting are the highlights and shadows. So let's start with the shadows. We want shadows on 2 places. First a drop shadow from the top part of the pipe and a side shadow. This is super easy to make. Just grab the pen tool and draw the drop shadow just below the top part. Remember that you can make this completely straight line if you hold Ctrl while you click to add a node, and then intersect it inside. And give it a shadow color with our color selection technique. Now do the same for the other side shadows. Try to make the shadows of roughly the same width. When you're done, intersect them inside and give it the same color than the other shadow. Now here's a really nice technique to copy the color from one object to another super fast. You copy the object from which you want to get the colors with Ctrl C, and then you select the object you want to paste the colors with the object tool and hit Ctrl Shift B. This will apply the colors of the copied object's fill and stroke, as well as any other style properties like stroke width and gradient, to the selected object. This way you don't have to be constantly switching to the object and dropper tool to apply a common color. This is the fastest way to apply color to the highlights and shadows, because most of the time they will have a common color that repeats. So from now on, if you see that an object gets colored out of nowhere, it's because I'm pasting the style using this shortcut. Great, now for the highlights. We want to make it look like this is a metal material, and to do that, we are gonna make the highlight in a specific way. But let's start with the rim highlight. This one is the same as with the shadow, just make a perfectly straight line shape, intersect it inside and give it a fairly bright highlight color. This highlight should be on top of the shadow, hiding part of it. For the other highlights, we're gonna separate it into two to give the impression of a more complex material. So using the same method of creating shapes with straight lines, make a thin and a wider rectangular shape right next to each other. Intersect them inside and copy the highlight color, hopefully using the paste style method. Now let's save us some work and copy these two shapes and move them into the upper part of the pipe, moving them a bit to the side. Again, intersect them inside and give it the highlight color. A little note, you could have used the rectangle tool to create these rectangular highlights and shadows, but I thought it would be nice to show you how to create these shapes quickly using the pen tool. Now it's all a matter of creating the darker outline. Just duplicate the two pipe shapes, make a union, and give it a darker green stroke with a nice and thick width. And of course, send it below. In a previous lesson I told you that sometimes it's good to create skewed and uneven shapes to avoid parallel lines. Well, in this case, because the shape of the asset is important to the gameplay, it's a good idea to keep the silhouette as it is, with boring parallel lines and all. And since the highlight and shadow define the shape of the object, it's also a good idea to make them fit this boring shape. Now let's make the collectible coin. Grab the ellipse tool, and using a tile as a guide, draw an ellipse slightly less wide than the tile. Give it a gold yellow. You can copy my numbers for the color if you want. Now let's make the side of the coin. Duplicate the highlight and give it this lower brightness and saturation yellow. I also moved the edge slider a bit to the left to make it just a pinch orange. This coin is meant to be a collectible item, so I think it warrants a bit more colorful color scheme. Now to add some interest, let's create a circular carved plane in the center of the coin. Duplicate the front plane, change its color so you can see what you're doing, and holding Ctrl and Shift so you keep the proportions and scale from the center. Scale in. How much it's up to you and the type of coin you're going for. As far as color, remember we want a bit more colorful item. So we are gonna do the same we did with the side plane, not only lowering the lightness, but also lowering the saturation a bit, and moving the hue slider a bit towards the orange. Let's add a shadow in the inner plane. You know the drill, duplicate twice and move the upper copy a good quantity so the shadow shape is clearly visible from far away. This time sample the color from the plane and lower even more the lightness, saturation and hue so you get this really strong orange color. Okay, now it's time to make the highlight opposite to the light source. One thing, we want this highlight to be nice and thick so it's visible from far away. Plus it's gold so it's supposed to be shiny. So you have to make the highlight on the outer side of the curved plane, rather than the way we've been doing it before, on the inside section of a curved surface. Well, in my opinion, the easiest way to do this is to use a variation of the difference technique. To do this, duplicate the plane twice and change the color like you would normally do. And move this shape slightly to the side. Then you send it below the other shape. And now that it's visible, adjust only the colored shape instead of the top shape. When you're done, perform the difference. So you can see that's pretty much the same process, but slightly different. As far as the color, give it an almost white yellow. This will look good because it's supposed to be gold, and gold looks good with big, shiny highlights. But I want to give it an extra highlight to make it look even more shiny. Grab the pen tool and make this long shape that covers the whole coin. And of course, intersect it inside the coin with the frontal plane, move it below the curved plane, and give it the highlight color. One last thing I want to do with this highlight, I want to make it more interesting. More like it shows a texture. So with the pen tool, draw these blocks on top of the big highlight and perform a difference. And that's it for the coin. The last step, of course, it will be to create the outline. So select both the frontal and side ellipses, duplicate them, and perform a union. Give it a darker color with a nice and thick pixel width, and of course move it to the back. Regarding the colors technique we used, it's very common for artists to move slightly the saturation and hue slider when giving colors to shadows and highlights and different planes to create more colorful and interesting illustrations. I didn't talk about it until now because I thought that it wasn't necessary. But in this case of a collectible coin, we needed to make it as much colorful and contrasting as we could. So at the moment of picking colors, keep in mind that you are not bounded to only handle the L slider. Introducing other values, as long as you're subtle, will make your illustrations more colorful. Okay, let's continue with the items by making a crate. Don't worry, this one is easier than it looks. Grab the rectangle tool and create a rectangle the size of a tile. If you want, you can round it off just a bit, but not too much, just enough so the edges won't look that aggressive. And give it a mid saturation brown color. Now we want to create the different planks. I want to do the same we did with the bricks in the bricks lesson, and make them slightly skewed to make them look more cartoony. The easiest way to do this is to use the pen tool and the intersection technique. Don't forget, you just want to give it a slight twist. Don't exaggerate. Give it a lighter version of the brown color. In this case, I also moved the hue and increased saturation just a bit to make the planks pop up a bit more. For the next step, it would be helpful to keep the outline, so don't remove them yet. We're gonna give the crate shadows from the planks, so we need a clear separation between planks to guide us. This will add a lot of depth and detail to the asset. So with the pen tool, draw a single shape that will go through the entire crate. So as you draw, keep in mind that the shadow will change in length depending on whether there is a plank below or not. So make the shadow longer or shorter depending on that. Since the shadows will go through different colored objects, remember, we'll need to use the low opacity black shadow method. So you know what to do. Give it a black color and lower the opacity. and send it below the top plank, but above all the other ones. For the left plank, you could create the shadow and then perform a union with the top shadow so they share the same color properties. There is also the diagonal plank. Also, don't forget the always useful paste style command with Ctrl-Shift-B, so you don't have to give the shadows color manually. Okay, now I want to add a small detail that's really gonna make a difference. I want to add this separation or indentation that these types of planks often have. For this, create a straight line with the pen tool. Remember that you can hold Ctrl while you place a point to make it perfectly horizontal. Give it a darker shade of brown than the planks. Now with the object tool, duplicate it and move it down so it's sharing a border with the other one. And give this copy a lighter shade of the brown of the planks. Select both shapes and group them. Now move this group to the center of each plank. As you place them, you'll need to rotate them in the same direction as the plank. And of course handle the right stack order. Don't worry about them sticking out, we'll fix that in a minute. Great, now it's time to remove the parts that are sticking out. We have two options, to use an intersection or to limit the visibility using clips. Previously I said that I always prefer to use intersections for simple cases, because they tend to prevent problems down the road with more complex illustrations. Well, in this particular case, since it's such a simple asset, it's easier to go in and use a clip instead of an intersection. The problem is that here an intersection would require to go in and dismantle every single group and also transform each of the strokes to paths before we could perform any Boolean operation. Just clip each of these groups with the mind box shape or with the planks, and it'll be super easy in this case. This back part of the crate also needs these lines to make it look like it's made of multiple other planks. So move a couple of copies down. You're probably gonna have to change the color so they better fit the darker color they are against. One tiny little detail. I want to create 4 nails on each corners to have some area of details in the borders. Since this is gonna be seen from far away, the nails are gonna be super simple. Just a perfect ellipse with a darker shade of grey. One last detail, grab the pen tool and draw this half moon shape. Make it a really light shade of grey to imply the intense highlight of metal. And now if you want, you can give it a quick shadow. Duplicate the circle, give it a full black and lower the opacity. And don't forget to move it a bit down. And duplicate it to the 4 corners. Let's create the highlight and shadows of the overall crate. This is what will make it look more three-dimensional. You know what to do. Create the highlight shape above using the pen tool. Again, be careful of the corners. Make sure to give it some roundness there so they fit the shape. The same with the shadow shape below. And don't forget this top plane that's pointing up in this plank. This plane also needs a highlight. Now give them the classic highlight and shadow colors. There is one last detail I want to add. I want to add some slight destruction or cuts here and there to add more interest to the whole object. Don't worry, it won't be hard. We are just gonna use some unions and differences to add some spikes in a few places. First, let's start by making some planks more interesting. I want a couple of big cuts in the top and in the middle plank. So grab the pen tool and draw a spike. We're gonna do something similar to what we did with the brick block. Then select the spike and plank and perform a difference to carve that area. We also want to add some spikes in the highlights to imply some damage in the corner that's letting some light or shadow through. So repeat the same steps, draw a few spikes with the pen tool, only that this time we want to add the spike to the highlight or shadow, so use a union instead of a difference. Okay, for the finishing touches. After making some tests, I realized that I prefer to keep the outline of each plank. Otherwise they kinda blend too much. There's not enough contrast. So instead of removing the stroke, just give it a darker brown than the other colors, maybe the same color than the outer outline. And as far as size, make the stroke size small. The goal of these outlines is to make the separation between planks more obvious, not to encapsulate the entire asset, so you want a small stroke size. And of course we want some large outline as well, so grab the main back shape, duplicate it, you can give it the same color as the plank outlines, and of course give it a nice thick pixel width. The grate is done. Now if you want you can make it fit a tile by using the same snapping method I showed you in the last lesson. Now let's make the mushroom power up. As always, we are going to be using a single tile as a guide for the stroke sizes. Now, this item is a bit different than the other ones. It's a bit more organic. This means that there is more room to play with the shape, moving and adjusting the nodes and getting the shape you want. So first, let's start by quickly creating the two main shapes of the mushroom, the stem and the cap. The idea here is to get the proportions right off the bat. After we have the proportions, we can go in and start adjusting the shapes of both. So grab the rectangle tool and create a rectangle that fits about this big in a tile. Notice a couple of things. First, that is in the center. Second, that it's really short and it doesn't even reach the half point of the tile. Now with the modifier, round it off a bit. For the cap, just make an ellipse that goes through the other shape as I'm showing you here. Now that we have the proportions, let's start modifying these shapes and giving them the final shape. Let's start with the cap. With the ellipse selected, go to Path, Object to Path, to get access to the nodes. Now, since this is a more organic shape, copying exactly what I'm doing is gonna be a bit harder. Just try to place the nodes in the same place that I did, and go from there. So grab the two nodes at the sides and lower them. Grab the node at the bottom and move it a bit up. Then adjust the length of the handles of each node till you get a silhouette similar to mine. Finally, give it a nice saturated orange red as a fill and remove the stroke. For the stem, it's easy. Give it a reddish white color. Just sample the red color and lower the saturation and move the lightness up till it's almost white, but with a tint of red. To me, this color just looks more pleasant than a grayish white. It makes it feel more like a real mushroom. First, remove the top two nodes, so you get only two. And introduce this curvature to imply that the form is actually cylindrical. Adjust the proportions by moving, scaling and rotating the stem shape if you need. Now let's add the details. For the cap, let's add the classic mushroom spots. This is super easy. Just pick the ellipse tool and draw 3 or 4 spots. I like to add one that's gonna be cut with an intersection, just to imply some volume. Chances are that you need to modify them or rotate them a bit. To modify the spots, remember that you could use Path Object to Path to transform the spot into a path, or the shortcut Ctrl-Shift-C. For the stem, I want to add a couple of beady eyes. With the ellipse tool, create one elongated ellipse. Give it a dark gray color, not quite full black, but close. Now create a smaller, more circular ellipse and give it a whitish color. Again, not quite full white, but close. And put it on the left side of the black eye. Duplicate the eye to the side, and since we want it to be in a sort of 3/4 view, offset a bit the two eyes to the side, so it appears like it's looking to the side. And now the shadows. This is quite simple. We want to imply that this cap has a lower plane. So with the pen tool, draw all around it defining this lower plane. When you're done, adjust the nodes. You also want a shadow on the right side to be consistent with the rest of the assets. Just draw it, intersect it inside, and join it with the other shadow by performing a union. Notice that the shadow is overlapping one of the spots, so we're gonna have to use a black color with a lower opacity as a shadow color. For the shadow in the stem, don't forget the drop shadow from the mushroom cap, and the right side. When you're done, intersect it inside and give it the same shadow color than the cap. Of course, the last step is gonna be to create the outline of the two main shapes, the stem and cap. So you know the drill. Create a red and thick outline using a duplicate of the main cap shape and send it to the bottom. For the stem, because the stem is in front of the cap, you want the outline to be behind all shapes of the stem, but in front of all shapes of the cap. And we are done with the items. Remember that because these items will have a different function than the other assets, we may need to make some quick adjustments at the moment of putting them in the final illustration. It's gonna be mostly a few quick changes in scale or width size, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Every platformer needs some kind of user interface to display some important information like lives, coins gathered, power-ups, that kind of stuff. In this couple of lessons we are gonna make the assets to create a super simple user interface for our game. Now, we don't need a fancy illustrative UI. In fact, for this type of game, the best type of UI is gonna be a simple one that won't occupy too much space and don't distract from the game experience. So in this lesson, we're gonna draw the main couple of assets that we are gonna need. And then we are finishing the last steps in the final illustration when we have all the other assets in place. Just so we can make some adjustments a bit more informed of with what is the UI gonna interact. We need a heart counter. Most Mario games don't have damage counter, but this isn't a Mario game. It's our own game and we can do what we want. So let's make the hearts. Making hearts is basically vector illustration 101, but I want to show you a nice technique that you can use to make any type of symmetrical asset. One thing before we start, in this lesson I'll draw the hearts the width of one tile. But since this is meant to be the UI, most likely we'll have to adjust the size to fit the final composition. Okay, grab the pen tool and place the points just like I'm showing you now. This is gonna be 1/2 of our heart. Adjust the position and handle of these two nodes till you're happy with the shape. And then select the two nodes and transform them to smooth type to introduce the roundness. Now switch to the object tool and hit Ctrl D to duplicate it, holding Ctrl so it's constrained to the horizontal axis. Move it to the other side, and then hit the H key to flip it horizontally. I think you get what we are gonna do now. Move it so the two nodes in the middle intersect. And here we are taking advantage of a nice little feature of the node tool. We can join two nodes, even if they belong to completely different objects. Once those two nodes join, the two objects will join into one as well. So with the pen tool, first select both half hearts, and now you should see all the nodes from both objects. Just select the two nodes in the middle and click on the Join Selected Nodes button. This one over here. Now that you join those two nodes, the two halves become a single path, but that doesn't mean that the nodes at the bottom automatically joined. So go in there and join the two nodes with the same button and close the path. Give it a nice red color. And remove the stroke. And that's it. This technique can be used with pretty much every symmetrical object you want. Now there is a path effect that gives you a much more robust set of tools for creating mirrored paths, but I think that's a bit overkill for the more simple shapes like this one. Now let's add a couple of details to make the heart nicer looking. First let's add a shadow. Nothing fancy, just grab the pen tool and draw a shadow over the right side. When you're done, use an intersection to remove the excess. And now give it a shadow color. For the highlight, I want to make something slightly different. I want to roughly imply that this is something like a glass or some shiny material like that. Now to make something like a realistic glass material would be considerably more complicated, and I don't want to waste that time in a simple UI lesson, but I want to do something different. The highlight is gonna be just a couple of ellipses with a very intense highlight color, almost white. This is how a glass-like material captures highlights, usually with two ellipses, one big and one or two smaller ones at the side. Okay, now to give it something extra. Instead of making the single dark outline like we've been doing, we're gonna create a white outline to further give the impression that this is a shiny surface. Believe me, it will help a lot. You know the drill? Duplicate the main shape, remove the fill and give it a white stroke. This stroke is gonna be smaller than the bigger darker stroke that we are gonna make in a minute, so give it a smaller pixel width. Then send it to the back. Repeat the same steps for the other outline. This is gonna be the darker outline, so you're gonna have to sample the red color and make it darker. This time give it a considerably larger width. Since you duplicated the heart shape, the pixel width is gonna have to be bigger to show through the other outline. And that's it for the full heart. You can group it if you want. But I thought it would be fun to make a couple of other variations, a half energy heart and a fully depleted heart. Both super fast to make. Let's start with the fully depleted heart. Duplicate the full heart to the side, ungroup it if you grouped it, and delete the shadow, two highlight shapes, and the actual red heart shape. Now the only thing visible is the two outlines. Select the white outline and give it a fill. What we want is a slightly lighter color than the darker outline, but then also lower the saturation. So after sampling the color of the outline, on top of moving the L slider to the right, move the S slider to the left, and you should get this Bordeaux color. And of course we don't want a white highlight, so give the stroke the color of the fill, just hold shift when you sample. For the half depleted heart, it's also super easy. With the pen tool, drag a perfectly straight line down the middle. You can use a snapping to snap to the nodes in the middle, but I'll just eyeball it. This object is gonna be really small, so there is no need to be this perfect. Then finish the shape covering the right half. Duplicate the red heart shape and perform an intersection. Give it the color of the Bordeaux backfill. Let's organize them together like they will be in the final project. I'll use 4 hearts, 2 full, 1 half, and 1 depleted. Here you can use the align and distribute dialog to tidy everything up. Make sure each heart is grouped, otherwise there's gonna be a huge mess. Go to Object, Align and Distribute. Then select them all and go to this button to distribute them all in equal distance horizontally. If we leave the hearts like this, depending on what's gonna be on the background, it may or may not be visible. The same happens with all the other UI elements. The fastest and simplest solution is to give the UI elements a background. And we won't complicate with complex backgrounds. The overall style of the game is super simple, so we'll just use a black rectangle with a lowered opacity for all the UI elements backgrounds. This is extremely simple to make, just a black rectangle with lowered opacity. So instead of wasting time here, we'll draw them in the final illustration so we can adjust it and make it fit better with the rest of the assets. Okay, one last UI element. I want to include a power-up item. Nothing too complex, just a simple icon so the overall UI won't feel as empty. My original idea was to make something like the droppable power-ups from Mario World, where at the center of the screen there was this box that stored one power-up, and you could hit a button to drop it at any time. So I could just put the mushroom power-up that we made in the items lesson. But I don't want to repeat myself, I want this mockup to feel more like a real game, so I'll draw a new simplified power-up just for this lesson. This power-up is gonna be the classic fire flower. So with the pen tool, create this long stroke and bend it a little. And give it a fairly thick stroke width. To me 5 pixels was enough. Now, grab the ellipse tool and create an elongated ellipse. With the object tool, rotate it a little. Adjust the scale so this flower part is about more than half the entire figure. Great, now let's make the petals. Since this is a simple iconic illustration, we don't want more than 4 big petals. So grab the ellipse tool and put 4 ellipses in each corner. And when you're done, perform a union with all of them. Now for the inner part of the flower, a couple of ellipses together should work. And now the leaves. This is super simple. With the pen tool, just make this simple leaf shape and duplicate it to the other side. You want to make a couple of quick adjustments so they won't look exactly the same. When you're done, you may want to add a line in the middle to imply the leaf stalk. One last step, I don't like this inclined plane at the bottom of the stem. I would rather to be flat. So this has an easy solution. Just select the stem stroke and go to Path, Stroke to Path. Now the stroke is a path. You can grab one of the nodes with the node tool and make it flat. We wanted the stem to be a path rather than a stroke anyways, since we need it so we could create the outline. And that's it for the shapes. Now let's give all these objects some color to make them pretty. First of all, give the flower a red color. And of course remove the stroke. For the inner shapes, I'll be using a white and an orange. For the stem and leaves, I'll be giving it this green. Again, if you want, you can just stop the video and check the color numbers in the HSL sliders to copy my colors exactly, but I believe that creating your own colors can be more fun, so it's up to you. Now for the shadows. For the shadow of the flower part, I don't want to complicate myself drawing anything. Let's just use the difference technique. You know what to do? Duplicate twice, give the upper shape a different color, move it a bit to generate the shadow, and perform the difference and give this shape a shadow color. For the shadows in the stem, you want a drop shadow below the flower part. So draw a simple shadow and perform an intersection to remove the excess. For the shadows in the left leaf, just make a shadow in the lower part and intersect it. Now here comes the slightly more complex variation. Do the same with the right leaf, but continue down the right side of the stem. Remember that you're gonna have to have the silhouette of the leaf and the stem as a single shape to intersect the shadow shape. So before making the intersection, duplicate the right leaf and the stem and join them with a union. And use this new shape to intersect the shadow in and give it the same shadow color. We are almost done, but like with all other assets in this mockup, we want to create a darker outline for each part of the asset. So grab the main flower silhouette from the flower part, duplicate it with Ctrl D, give it a nice thick stroke, and give it a darker tone than the color of the shadow. For the stem part, it's made of multiple objects, the stem and the leaves. Luckily, we transformed the stem to a path before, so it's easy to select everything, duplicate it, and perform a union. Now give it the thick stroke and send it to the back. And give it a color darker than the shadow. And that's it, a new power-up. Only that this one is exclusive to the UI. The final step will be to make the background where the item is gonna go, but this is extremely simple, it's just a black rectangle with the opacity lowered and the corners rounded. Just like with the other UI elements, we'll draw them right into the final illustration so we can make any adjustments right there. And we are done with the UI. Because we don't know how the colors are gonna interact with the rest of the background, most probably the colors that we picked aren't gonna be definitive. We may need to crank up the saturation or lightness of a particular shape, so it's more visible in the final image, so we'll have to wait until the composition is done to make some final tweaks, as well as adding the final touches, like the background and the position of the elements. Let's start making the terrain, where the characters can walk and jump. Here's where we're gonna start creating the assets by finally using proper tiles. Not just using the grids for measuring the sizes, but actually using them to guide us in the process of creating repeating tileable patterns. But first, I want to show you that you can apply everything we'll see to tiled and non-tiled assets by equal. So before making the actual tiled assets, I want to start by creating this non-tiled floating platform that's very common in most 2D platformers. And on the way, show you the approach and techniques to create terrain that we'll be reusing when we make the actual terrain tile. This floating platform will be very similar to the actual tile assets. It's gonna use similar graphics and patterns. After all, it's gonna go in the same composition, but with the main difference that we'll have a bit more freedom, since we are not constrained to a single grid square, and we can focus more on the techniques and methods to creating terrain in general. But before start drawing, let's take a look at how other platformer games create this type of platform and terrain in general. So take a look at these screenshots of these 8 and 16-bit games. I know these games are not illustrated using vectors, but we can study and take inspiration from the design of the assets. Look at how the terrain, including the platforms, are usually separated in two. You have the top, usually with a nice green grass layer, and then you have the actual terrain below. Also notice how the grass grows, not only on the top, but also hangs a bit to the side, as if it was a real cross-section of a terrain with grass on top. This pattern is very common, not only for terrains with grass, but also pretty much any terrain. You see snow hanging to the side in the snowy terrains, or leaves in a jungle, or even rocks on a desert. This makes the graphics much more illustrative and therefore more appealing. Finally, a common pattern that you'll see in a lot of games, no matter the type, is to simplify the terrain texture with these wavy colorations. No matter the style, you'll see that creating these waves is a really efficient way to make an area give the illusion of being a cross-section of an actual terrain. And if you add a few varied things in there like rocks or bones, then the illusion will be even bigger. We are gonna design our terrain using these observations, so keep them in mind. We are not gonna use the grid to create the tiles, but we are still using it to guide ourselves for the sizes. In this platform will be about 3 tiles by 1.5 grid squares. So let us start with the grass. I want to show you a nice and easy way to build grass or any other organic shape using the Boolean union technique we saw in the techniques lesson. First, to guide yourself better, create a rectangle of 3 tiles wide and less than half a tile high. Now, using the ellipse tool, do like we did in the union techniques lesson and add a lot of ellipses overlapping. What you want here is to vary the sizes of the ellipses to create an interesting looking silhouette, avoiding creating more than 2 consecutive ellipses of the same size or width. So if you need, don't be afraid of grabbing the object tool and moving them around to get the best looking silhouette. Pay special attention to the edges. You want a nice protrusion of grass that leaves the 3 squares limit of the platform. When you're done, join everything with a union and give it this bright green color. Copy my colors if you want. Now, very important, we want a nice organic looking silhouette, and for that we're gonna need to make a couple of adjustments to the path. So go in and delete all nodes that are in the bumps. Basically delete everything that's not a corner node. Now that we have only nodes in the corners, we can easily grab the bumps with the node tool and move and drag each of them, so they look more like grass. What you want is to give it a bit of weight, like the mass of grass is falling because of gravity. Also, don't be afraid of moving the actual corner nodes to better adjust the silhouette so it looks nicer. Remember, the key here is variation. You want the grass to be more or less the height of a half a tile, but variate a lot the sizes of each mass. Now for the platform itself. Since this is a floating platform, I want to give it a nice interesting silhouette. So grab the pen tool and creating straight lines, make this uneven terrain shape. I want to make it about one tile high. When you're done, give it this orangey brown color. Okay, we're done with the form. Now let's give it the details. Let's start with the grass. First I want a highlight on top to emphasize a bit the walkable area. This is easy. Just use the pen tool to create a perfectly straight line on top and intersect it inside. Give it a highlight color, but make it subtle. This highlight is meant to imply that this area is walkable, but you don't want it to be distracting either. Okay, now I want to make the grass a bit more interesting. For that, let's give it a shadow area down below. The easiest way to do that is to use the difference technique. You know the drill, duplicate 2 times, change color and perform a difference. You want a nice and thick shadow area. When you're done, give it a shadow color. If you're feeling unsatisfied with the shape, you can always go in and adjust the path a bit with the node tool. Speaking of shadows, let's add a nice drop shadow in the terrain. This one is gonna be easy. Just duplicate the shape of the grass, send it below, and move it a bit down. As far as the color, we don't know what's gonna be below, so in this case, just give it a low opacity black shadow. And of course, intersect it inside the terrain area so it won't show outside. Great, one final step. With this grass shape, we want to give it a nice outline, just like with all the other assets. So you know what to do. Duplicate the main shape, send it below the other grass shapes, give it a nice and thick stroke width, and of course give it a darker shade of the same green. And we're done with the grass area for now. I recommend you to zoom out and see how it looks from far away. Now for the details in the terrain. Here we're gonna make a couple of more complex stuff. Don't worry, it won't be anything too difficult. What I want to do is to show you a few of the many ways in which you can add detail to a terrain. For this floating platform I want to create a bit of damage, like an eroded part. This is easy to make. Grab the pen tool and make this line with multiple planes. intersect it in on the lower side, and change the color to make it a bit darker than the other terrain. To emphasize the change in plane, let's add another plane right below. This one is easy. Use the difference technique. Make this new plane thinner, and again make it a bit darker. I want to make this new plane more interesting, so let's add some detail. Grab the pen tool and add 2 or more of these spikes or planes. They are supposed to be damaged just like the damage in the block or the crate. I feel this whole floating platform feels a bit plain. To help with this, I want to define a few planes in the border all around it. So with the pen tool, create a shape following more or less the silhouette of the terrain, and when you're done, intersect it inside. Now give it a low opacity black shadow like we've done so many times before, but this time I don't want us to leave it full black. It removes a bit of the color. The shadow in particular should be a bit warmer, so instead of leaving it like this, move the saturation slider all the way up and give the shadow a really dark, almost black brown. And of course adjust the alpha. You should notice that the color of the brown tints the shadow a bit, make it less dull. A fully black, low opacity shadow not only takes lightness from a color, but also takes saturation, so keep that in mind. Now to give it some nice detail. Do the same you did with the plane on top, create multiple shapes of damage, and join them with the shape using a union. I will repeat what I said originally in the block lesson. You don't want to oversaturate it with tons of these small details. Just add a few here and there where it feels empty. Okay, for the next step it will be really useful to enable snapping. Once you enable snapping, make sure that all the default options are on. I'm telling you in case that you leave the snapping to corners off from when we made the other assets. Now here comes the cool part. With the pen tool, create a shape that snaps to all 4 nodes to create a plane. Also don't forget to also snap to the damage detail if you need to. What we want is to give all planes that point to the right a darker tone to imply that the light is hitting those planes less. So you only need to create these shapes in the planes pointing to the right. As far as color, you can give it the same color than the shape below, maybe a bit darker, and you'll see that because of the transparency, the colors will multiply and you'll get the darker tone you want. Now for a couple of extra details to close up everything. With the pen tool, create a couple of these polygons on the top part. These are supposed to be carved planes resulting from damage, so give them the same color as the other plane below. And here's a tiny little detail that I like to add to all terrain. A few small rocks on the lower darker plane. These are super easy to do. With the pen tool, just draw a few 4 or 5 side planes polygons. Make them really small. They're not supposed to call attention to themselves. They're just a nice little detail. So give them a gray color that won't contrast too much with the color of the brown in the back. And we're done with the floating platform. We're gonna be reusing some of the things you've seen here to create the tileable terrain. So make sure to get everything in this lesson before taking the next one. Okay, let's finally start with the tiles. But before we begin drawing anything, I want to talk about what we need to approach the creation of our tiles. Because we want to be able to build not only the floors, but also platforms, we'll need to have a minimum of 4 different terrain tiles, so a platform looks good and complete. One tile for the top, the one that has the grass, another tile for the middle without grass, and at least 2 more tiles for the sides. These are the most common tiles you need for a simple platform, but this is if you're not counting other types of terrain like inclined terrains or any other special type. Now what we're gonna do to save up some time is to draw a single terrain patch that we're gonna reuse for the grass terrain tile on top and for the pure terrain tile on the bottom. In real life there is not that much benefit from doing this, but in this course, first I want to save up some time, and second, I think that it's kinda neat to be able to do these things using vectors. Anyway, let's get started. A quick thought. Just because the grid will represent a single tile in the game, it doesn't mean that we are forced to make each tile of a single unit. Remember, we are working with tiles for the convenience of using repeatable assets for the terrain, not because of any technical limitation. So these tiles we're gonna make are gonna occupy 4 grid squares in the final illustration. I believe that it looks better this way and we can create a bit more detailed terrain tiles without losing detail because it looks too small. Here I've imported the floating platform we made in the previous lesson. We're gonna take inspiration as well as sample the colors so we don't have to worry about anything but building the asset. So let's start. Grab the rectangle tool and with the snapping enabled, make a rectangle of 2 tiles by 2. And give it the same color as the main terrain color of the platform, this brown orange. Now we are gonna follow the same procedure than before to create the grass on top. But now we have a couple of extra things to think about, and that is that the grass needs to wrap back so it can tile. But one thing at a time. First grab the rectangle tool and make a rectangle of about half of a half tile. Repeat the same steps as before, add a few ellipses, and make sure that they all look uneven and organic. Also, to make the things easier for the next step, make sure that there is one similar size ellipse in the corners of both ends of the tile, being cut off at half point more or less. And this will simplify hugely the work for us. When we are done, join them all with a union, and of course intersect them inside the tile. Here comes the part where you make these bumps nicer and more organic with the node tool. Remove the unnecessary nodes so it's easier to grab them and adjust the bumps. Don't forget making them feel like they are being pulled by gravity. Now, if you followed my advice and place an ellipse in the middle of each end, this next step should be easy. Grab the two end nodes and open the Align and Distribute dialog. Go to Object, Align and Distribute. Now go to the Path section and click on this button. This will align both nodes at exactly the same vertical position. I think you know what you should do now. Make sure snapping is enabled and duplicate the two shapes to the side. And with the shape at the side, fix and adjust the original version so it gives a smooth transition between the two tiles. And repeat the same step with the other side. Great, we are done with the grass shape. But here I want to do something slightly different than what we did with the non-tileable platform. I want to do something that's pretty common for the graphics in these types of games, and that is to create a second layer of grass that's a bit darker and makes the tile a lot more interesting. So we are gonna repeat the exact same process than before, but just below the other grass. But the cool thing about vector illustration is that there is always a way to cheat, and here you can cheat a bit and save a lot of time. Let me show you how. This is easy. Duplicate the grass shape and snap it to the side so there are two grass shapes continuously. Since you adjust them so they should match perfectly. Duplicate these two shapes and join them into a single one with a union. Now move it below the other grass shape and down a bit. This is gonna be the second grass shape, and it should be a darker shade of the same green. Now here comes the cool part. Now you can slide it to the left or right, and you'll know for sure that it's gonna tile perfectly, since they are two tile shapes joined together. Here I also recommend you to flip it horizontally with the H key, so you get the extra variation. Once you place it and it looks sufficiently different than the other grass shape above, you should intersect it inside the tile. And if you want, you can make some final adjustments, like moving the nodes or making some minor transformations. And that's it for the shapes of the grass. Now let's do the same we did with the other grass shape, and give it some color and outline. First the highlight on top. Just draw a quick highlight on the upper part with the pen tool, and intersect it in. If you hold the control to make a straight line, obviously it will tile perfectly. Now sample the highlight color from the platform we made last lesson. For the shadows below, you know the drill. Using the difference technique, create a shadow shape on the lower part, and give it a shadow color. And repeat the same steps with the darker grass shape below. Now very quickly the drop shadows for the two grass shapes. And now for the outline, we want two outlines, one on the top grass shape and another for the bottom one. The only difference with the outline of the floating platform is that now we are gonna have to delete the sides so they tile as well. So once you select the right color thickness and position, select the outline shape, select both nodes at the sides with the node tool, and click on this button. This button removes the stroke between two or more selected nodes, which in this case is exactly what we want. Do the same with the two outlines on the left and right side. Now the grass and its outline is ready to tile perfectly. It may happen that after you remove the side of an outline, a bit of the outline leaves the tile square. This is because of the way the outline is rotated. To fix this, there is no other way than to transform this outline to a path and intersect it inside using a rectangle the size of a tile. So make sure to give it the final shape and size you want before transforming it to a path, because once you do it, it'll be impossible to adjust anything. Okay, now that we are done with the grass, let's make the actual terrain area. So let's start with our wave pattern. And remember, this pattern is gonna have to be usable for both the tile with the grass on top and the tile that's only terrain. So what I've come up with is to hide one of the waves below the two patches of grass. So the upper tile looks different, but it's the same design than the middle one. Duplicate the main tile to the side. To create the waves, we are gonna use the pen tool. So grab the pen tool and draw these wavy shapes. Don't worry about making them round, we're gonna round them in a second. Just worry about making them thick enough, and that they are in the right position. Remember, we want to hide one of them below the grass. So once you intersect them inside, you may want to move them up or down, or even scale them if you don't like the way they look. But make sure to leave one of them completely hidden by the grass shape. That's the reason why I wanted to duplicate the tile to the side, so we can see better where the grass was gonna be. Now it's time to give it some color. What you want to do is to give it a darker or lighter version of the orange we are using. Use the L slider along with the S slider to handle the lightness, but also the saturation on each of these waves. You may also want to play around a bit with the H slider to give it a bit of a different tone. Of course, always being as subtle as possible. We are gonna follow the same procedure that we followed with the grass shape to make the shape tile correctly, making sure that the two nodes at each side are at the same height with the Align and Distribute dialog. So if it's not open, go to Object, Align and Distribute. Select the two corresponding nodes and click on this button to put them at the same vertical level. And repeat the same steps with the other pair of nodes below. Now let's finally introduce the curvature. Select the nodes in the middle of the path, not the outer ones, just the ones in the middle, and click on this button to transform them to smooth type. This will introduce a curvature depending on the angle of the corner. But now that we've introduced the curvature, we need to make sure it flows nicely into the next tile. So let's do the same we did with the grass, enable snapping, and duplicate everything to the side and adjust the handle so each curvature flows nicely between tiles. Remember that the end objective of each tile is that you cannot tell when one tile ends and the next one begins. After you adjust one side, you have to adjust the other one. So duplicate it to the other side and repeat the same steps. Okay, what I want to do with these shapes is to give the illusion of indented and raised planes. For this we're going to be using the same technique we use with the platform. We're going to create a little plane to indicate whether the plane is going in or out. So using the difference technique, that you should be super familiar by now, create a thin shape above and below each of the three wave shapes. For the two indented planes, follow the same steps that you did with the carved in question mark. Give it a shadow color for the shape above and a highlight for the shape below. For the raised plane, it is the exact opposite, a highlight above and a shadow below. Okay, now for the final step for the terrain, the details. Let's add some nice details like we did with the floating platform. First grab the ellipse tool and draw a few ellipses here and there in the empty spaces and give them the same color than the shadow. Remember that if you want more variation, you can just stack more than one ellipse together to get a slightly different shape. Another thing you can do to create even more variation is to do the same thing we did with the item and add shapes to the shadow area to imply some irregularities in the terrain. Adding a few spikes and a few polygons will go a long way to make the terrain feel more organic. Remember to sample the color from where you are adding the detail. It will also be a good idea to join these details with a union. For the final step, I like to add a few rocks just like we did with the floating platform. So draw a few small rocks here and there in the empty spaces. What you want to do basically is to fill the empty space, but without making it too busy that's distracting. If an area is too detailed, it may look good on its own, but it may not look that great when there are a ton of tiles all together. Here's a tiny detail I like to do. I like to create yet another polygon shape just below the rocks to make them contrast a bit more. So draw the polygons with the pen tool and send them below the rocks. The last step should be to try it with the grass shape and see if they work together. Remember that this terrain is also acting as the lower part of the upper tile with the grass, so you should see if it works with the grass on. If they don't, you can always grab the pen tool and make some adjustments, maybe moving these planes a bit up or down, or moving some details around. When we created the grass outline, the stroke was leaving a bit the silhouette, so here I just corrected that using the group snapping method to snap the grass to the corner of the tile, placing it entirely inside of it. Now the tile really has the exact shape of the square and it's perfectly tileable. Okay, we are done with the upper grass terrain tile and the middle terrain tile, but we still need the two end tiles that will make the floor and platforms look way nicer. So let's do that in the next lesson. In this lesson we're gonna finish with the terrain by creating the tiles that are gonna go to the side. We need two of these tiles, one to end the upper terrain tile, the one with grass, and another to end the lower pure terrain tile. If you want, you can create another two for the other side, but the most common thing is that you just flip them horizontal if you need. So we are going to be making only two tiles. First of all, we need the finished tiles as a guide. I grouped them so they won't cause any problems at the moment of drawing. A curious thing about these side tiles is that they won't gonna occupy one entire square, only about less than half of one. It's a purely decorative tile. Without it, a platform or floor would look unfinished. So what we're gonna try to do is something similar to the end section of the floating platform we made previously. Okay, let's start with the grass again. Just follow the same steps you followed to create the grass in the last lesson. Only that this time try to define a nice looking ending silhouette for the grass. Also remember to not overextend, with 3 or 4 ellipses that reach to about half a tile is just fine. Join them with a union. Notice how the shape overextends a bit to the tile right next to it. We'll need to cut out the excess, so grab a rectangle and snap it to the tile. Use this shape to intersect the outline so it fits perfectly within the tile. Try to make them look nice and natural by adjusting the silhouette with the node tool. And try to make this shape fit with the end of the other grass shape, making the transition go as smooth as possible. When you're done, repeat the same step with the lower grass shape. Again, use 3 or so ellipses and make sure this grass shape won't extend past the other top grass shape. This way it looks more like a cliff. The next few steps, you should know them by heart by now. Give them the color, use the difference technique to create the shadows and highlights, adjust the shadows and highlights so they connect with the ones in the other tile, and give it the outlines. This time you are gonna have to cut the outline in the right side so it won't overlap with the other tile. Just select the nodes you want to delete and go to the button Delete Segment. and the grass section of the tile is done. Try it out to see if it fits with the grass in the other tiles. Okay, now it's time for the terrain section. Remember, this area is meant to give a nice ending to the platform, so we are going to be doing something similar to what we did with the edges of the floating platform. We're going to create a side plane, but there is a tiny little issue we have to have in mind. Remember that we used the same terrain tile to create the tile with grass and the tile with only terrain. Well, we won't do that now, mainly because this won't look good. We want the extra variation in the silhouette at the edges, so we'll need to make two tiles, one that connects the patches of grass and the other one that continues with the shape. So let's begin with the upper tile, the one with the grass. This one is simple. With the pen tool, just make these irregular straight lines to imply some broken terrain. I prefer to give it a bit of a slope and leave some grass hanging to the side to make it look more like a cliff. Here I recommend you to just move on as if you were making a single 2-tile long shape. Don't mind where the first and second tile start. We're gonna cut this shape into two neatly separated tiles in a moment. Now let's separate this shape into two tiles. Grab the rectangle tool and make sure that there is no smoothing in the corners. And with the grid snapping enabled, create two rectangles that fit perfectly the squares, one on each tile, and send it below the L shape. Duplicate the L shape and intersect it with one of these rectangles. With the leftover shape, intersect it inside the other rectangle. And there you go. You have two different L shapes that fit perfectly within a tile square. By doing this, we are skipping over a ton of headaches with snapping shapes so they fit and tile correctly. As far as the details, well, of course, the first thing we should do is to continue with the wavy shapes. This is easy, just enable snapping, with the grid snapping disabled, and with the pen tool snap to one of the corners of the shape and finish it off. I'm just using a single shape here, cause this shape is really simple, so I leave the silhouette and finish it off in one go. Try to make the waves transition in a smooth way, and repeat the same steps for all the three waves. When you're done, intersect them inside and give it the colors. The next step is making the shadows and highlights. You just made all these in the previous lesson. The quickest way to do them is to use the difference technique. Eyeball the height so it fits with the other highlights or shadow. I didn't notice that this outline also leaves the tile, so I'm repeating the same steps I did with the other outline to keep it inside of the tile. And one final detail. I want to do the same with it with the floating platform and create some sort of outer plane to accentuate the border. So with the pen tool, create this thin shape that roughly follows the silhouette of the contour all the way down. Again, make it continue to the next tile as if it were a single shape. When the moment to intersect the shape in comes, the only thing you'll need to do is to create an extra copy before intersected in each tile. And the end result should be that you have two shapes that fit exactly in the area they should be. Give this shape the dark brown color with a very low alpha that we use as a shadow color in the floating platform. And now for the last little detail, enable snapping and start creating these planes on all the areas where they should be pointing down. When you're done, give it the same low alpha dark brown color. And because the stacking of the two alpha values, this should read as being even darker. If you have any problem, adjust the alpha a bit more. And we are done with the tiles. With these four shapes, you should be able to create any type of platform with any dimensions. Of course, there are a lot of possible things you can do here. For example, with what you know now, it shouldn't be too hard to create things like holes in the terrain, more elaborated platform endings, or even diagonal or sloped tiles. In fact, any of these will be a really nice homework. We really just scratched the surface, but now you have the knowledge to experiment and try new things. And that's exactly what I recommend you to do now. Now that we are done with all the tiles and assets, there is one last thing we need before moving on to make the background and to assemble the mockup, and that is the characters. I believe that having characters on the mockup will go a long way to sell the illusion of being a screenshot of a real game. So in the next few lessons we are gonna make a Goomba enemy clone, a Piranha plant clone, and the playable character that is not a clone and is completely original, Marlo the Plumber. But before we begin, I want to give you a couple of quick warnings about the way we are gonna work. First, now that we are dealing with more complex and time-consuming illustrations, I'm gonna speed up the pace a bit and assume that you are pretty familiar with all the tools and techniques that we are using. I won't be using anything that I haven't shown you before, so if you have trouble following what I'm doing, rewatch a couple of the older lessons, especially the techniques lesson. And second, this course is not about character creation, and certainly it's not about character creation for games. These characters that we are gonna be making are basically a quick sketch and are not designed in any way for an actual game. If you want to create characters for your own game, you probably are gonna have to have in consideration things like the gameplay or the animations or the engine that you're using. The characters that you're gonna see here are more of a demonstration for the sake of a more complete mockup. However, I believe that there is value in making these characters if you are willing to research more about design and animation and all that. Then you're gonna be able to use everything you learn here. Great! With that out of the way, let's start with the easiest character, the Goomba clone. Again, we are gonna use the grid as a way to guide ourselves. Let's start with the main part of this mushroom with feet, the cap. So grab the ellipse tool and draw an ellipse the size of a single tile. It does not need to snap, just eyeball it. We are using the grid as a rough guide. Now let's edit the shape with the node tool, so go to Path, Object to Path, to get the nodes. Now grab the lower node and move it up till it goes just past the middle point of the tile. Here you can just adjust the nodes to get the exact shape of the cap you want. As far as color, I'm just giving it this orange. but you can give it the color you want. Now let's make the stem. Just use the pen to create this square looking shape. Make the sides a bit bent so they look a bit more organic. And give it an almost white orange. Just crank up the L slider while selecting an orange hue. To me this looks way more pleasant than a grey-white. Now make the back side of the cap. Just use the pen tool and follow the shape of the cap. A light orange will do. Something in between the cap and the stem color. Now for the feet. I want to create this comically big feet. And for that, grab the pen tool and create this rectangular shape. This is gonna be one feet. Now select the top left node and set it to smooth type with this button. And move and adjust this node so it feels like a shoe being looked from the side. Give it the orange color we've been using. Duplicate it to the side. We're gonna make the other feet. But I want to make it so this one is being looked from the front. This is super easy to make. Just grab the other node and set it to smooth as well and adjust the curvature. Okay, now for the last part of the character, the eyes. Grab the ellipse tool and draw one elongated ellipse. Duplicate it to the side so it intersects with the other one. How much they intersect, it's up to you. But this is supposed to be the silhouette of the eyes. When you're done, perform a union to join both shapes, and here you can make some adjustments with the node and curves to make the whole shape more interesting. Put it in place and adjust the scale. You want the eyes to leave the silhouette of the cap for that extra comedic touch. Give it a whitish orange like the one you gave it to the stem. Now to create the pupils. These are just gonna be two perfect circles, maybe stretched down a bit. So with the ellipse, draw a circle, make it really small, and for color, just use a really dark orange. So it's a really dark brown. For the last face details, grab the pen tool and draw these two large rectangular eyebrows. Make them look angry. Don't worry if they are not perfect rectangles, they are supposed to be a bit uneven. Draw them so they are not exactly symmetrical. Give them an almost black-gray. And if you want, don't be afraid of adjusting the nodes in the eyes so they won't show through the eyebrows. And we are done with all the pieces of the character. But that doesn't mean that we are done with it quite yet. Like I said a minute ago, now we are working with more organic and complex constructions. Chances are that the shapes need a quick retouch to adjust and harmonize everything. This is especially important if you build a character by drawing all shapes by separate and then assembling them together, like we did. Now that you have the whole character built, you can see how all pieces fit together and make the right adjustments. Based on that, changing the proportions and scale of the different pieces, refine the individual shapes with the node tool, or, why not, remove or add a different shape altogether. After you're done with the finalizing the shapes phase, it's time to give it the outline and the shadows. We're gonna be using a single shadow and no highlight. The characters are already complex enough as they are. We don't need the extra complication. So for the shadows, this one is pretty similar to the shadows in the mushroom power-up. Just grab the pen tool and create a border below, this time a bit thinner than the one in the mushroom. And a shadow to the side. A nice thing I'm doing here is to round off a bit the joint between the two shadows to imply that the border is a bit rounded. Then you join them into a single shape using a union. Don't forget to give it a shadow color. Then a drop shadow on the stem. For the shoes, just a round shadow on the right side. And I want a drop shadow from the eyebrows to emphasize them. And that's it for the shadows. Now the character feels a lot more solid. As far as the outline, we want 3 different outlines. One in front for the 2 feet, one for the head, and one for the stem. So you know what to do. Duplicate the 2 feet, join them, and make the shape into a thick darker orange outline and send them below the feet but in front of the rest of the body. Then make the stem outline, follow the same steps, and send them below the stem but in front of the cap shapes. Finally end with the cap outline. This outline is going to have to cover not only the cap, but the eyes, eyebrow, and also the lower part of the cap. So in order to make an outline of that shape, you're going to have to select all those shapes, duplicate them, and perform a union. Now you can use this shape to make the outline. And we are done with our discount Goomba. Now let's move on to our discount Piranha plant. Okay, let's crank up the difficulty just a bit and make a clone of the classic Piranha plant enemy. First, let's make the stem. Grab the pen tool and create this straight line of about 2.5 tiles. Bend it like I'm showing you here, using the minor grid lines to guide yourself. You want to give it this S shape that you're seeing here. This is gonna be the stem, and it has to be very visible and look like it can hold the weight of the head. And finally give it a light green color. For the head of the plant, make an ellipse of about 4 squares. And scale it horizontally, about less than half a tile. Place it on top of the stem and rotate it a bit down so it better matches with it. You can always adjust this later on, so don't worry about too much about the placement. Finally, give it a fairly saturated red. We need to add the classic lips and teeth that's so characteristic of this character. So using the pen tool, create a triangle to cut out the head shape. Draw a triangle of about 45 degrees. And perform the difference to cut out that section. Here's where you adjust the nodes if necessary. I recommend you to delete the unnecessary nodes and adjust the shape manually with the node tool, till you get something that you like. But a Piranha plant clone is not complete without the lips. With the pen tool on top of the head border, draw this fairly thick arrow shape. Give it a light gray color. As always, I recommend you to leave a trace of the red color so it looks a bit more interesting than plain gray. And now start rounding it. What I'm doing here is holding the Shift key and clicking on a node and drag to the side. This pulls one of the two handles depending on where you drag, and this allows you to introduce a subtle curvature. Getting the shape that you want like this may need a bit of trial and error, so keep tinkering with it till you're satisfied with the shape you get. Once you're done, the next step is creating the teeth. These are pretty simple, just 3 rectangles on each side. Give them a darker shade of the gray of the lips, and move them below them. Now for a couple of finishing touches to the design. We're gonna create this part of the flower that joins the stem and head. In the research that I did, it was called a receptacle or sepal, depending on what these parts are meant to be, which I don't know. I just wanted some shape to add to the back of the head, so they could be either. Also, from now on I'll be calling it the receptacle, because I need a name for it, and to me it just sounds better than sepal. But first, let's analyze the shape because it can be a bit confusing. This shape can be separated in 2 parts. One, of course, the saw-like teeth, and the other in this trapezius-like shape. You'll see why we are making this shape in a moment. Make sure the trapezius shape follows and covers the back side of the head shape. And then add the saw shape. I recommend you to join them with a union. Okay, so here comes the important part. Remember what I showed you a minute ago about holding Shift to introduce a curvature from a straight corner node? Well, we're gonna do that with all the teeth in this shape. Just hold Ctrl and drag to both sides. We want a nice rounded leaf-like shape. When you're done, give it the color of the stem. And we're almost done, but I think it needs another detail. I want another of this receptacle. You could redraw it again, but it's way easier to just duplicate it and make it larger. Change its color to a darker shade of the green and put it below the other. If you want, you could go in and change a bit the curvature of the teeth so it doesn't look like a duplicated shape. Okay, and for a final detail, I want to add a couple of leaves to balance the design a bit more. This is super easy. You've already done some leaves in the flower power-up, so it's the same here. Just make the leaves shapes with the pen tool and make them really big. What you want is that they balance the overall design, making the silhouette more interesting. Make 2 of them, put 1 on each side, and tinker with the rotation and scale. Give it the same color as the stem. Then if you want, you can create this vein in the middle. Give it a darker shade of the green, and also give it a fairly thick pixel width, enough so it's visible from far away. And that's it for the drawing of the shapes. Now to give it some shadows and details. First of all, I want to start with the lips. So give it a shadow shape on the lower part of the upper teeth and in the lower part of the lower teeth. Then intersect those shapes in and give them a shadow color. You may also want to give the teeth the same color than the shadow color, just for the sake of consistency. For the head shape, we want a shadow on the lower part, and maybe also a drop shadow from the lips. So grab the pen tool and draw these shapes. And when you're done, intersect them inside the head. Don't worry about the receptacle, just put the shadow shape below. Now for the shadows of the receptacle. Of course, we need a drop shadow from both shapes, so you know what to do. Duplicate the shape, move them a bit to the side and down so they are visible, and give them a shadow color. Finally, intersect them inside the right shapes. If you're bothered by the fact that there are 2 shadows overlapping here, you could just duplicate the black alpha shape and perform a difference with the drop shadow. This way you eliminate the section where they are overlapping. But you also want a shadow for the lower side of the receptacle. Just don't complicate yourself with this. Don't forget that this part is gonna be really small on the screen. Make a single shadow shape that goes through the two shapes. And at the moment of intersect them in, you'll have to duplicate both shapes of the receptacles and then join them with a union and use this shape to intersect the shadow shape. Don't forget that you're gonna have to use a black color with lowered alpha, because it goes through two shapes of different color. The stem and leaves also needs shadows, but in order to be able to intersect the shadows with the stem, we need it to be a path. So you know what to do? Select it and go to Path, Object to Path. Now draw the shadow only on the parts of the stem that are roughly pointing down. So you'll have to separate the shadow into two shapes, like I'm doing here. As far as the leaves, don't complicate yourself, just make the shadows on the lower side of the leaves. Once you're done, intersect them in. For the color, I'm just sampling from the black shadow. And we're done with the shadows. Now for the final step, the outlines. These outlines may complicate you in a couple of places, depending on the way you drew the plant, or more specifically, the teeth. So in order to demonstrate how to solve that problem, I purposefully drew the teeth so they show this problem. But first let's start easy. Let's make the outline of the stem. You know what to do? Select all the paths that makes up the stem, including the two shapes from the receptacle, duplicate them, and join them together. Give it a nice and thick stroke, give it a darker shade of the green of the stem, and move it behind it. And now it's time for the head outline. Select all shapes that makes up the head, including the mouth and teeth. Duplicate them, join them, give them the thickness, the color, and move them to the back as you've done so many times over. But now you're probably gonna have a problem depending on how you drew the teeth. Well, the problem you may encounter is that you made the teeth a bit too sharp, causing Inkscape to flatten the stroke. Inkscape does this to avoid really long and uncomfortable outlines, resulting from really thick strokes and really sharp corners. Most of the time this is exactly what you want, but sometimes, like in the case of these teeth, it can really result in really distracting areas in the outline that call attention to themselves. One solution will be to go to the Stroke tab in the Fill and Stroke dialog, and with this option selected, which should be selected by default, increase the number in the input until the stroke in the teeth area are no longer flattened. But now a new problem is evident. Now the stroke in the teeth are too long and they intersect each other. This is the problem Inkscape wanted us to avoid with the default options. Well, the only solution to this problem, while keeping the stroke nice and thick, is to go in there and modify the shape of the stroke manually with the node tool. Modify the nodes, pulling them back a bit, while trying to keep the biggest quantity of stroke outline in each teeth. If you see that you can possibly show too much outline because the position of the teeth makes it really hard, you could pick a teeth and move them slightly to the side and adjust the outline accordingly. Don't worry if from up close the stroke looks a bit wonky. What's important is that it looks okay from far away, so zoom out constantly. I know manually adjusting an outline is tedious, but it's the only way to have our cake and eat it too. And here is it. the finalized Piranha plant clone.